Thank you, Chair. Professor Osborne, thank you for your evidence today. It's fascinating. I just wondered, you mentioned bias and technology. I just wondered if you could just drill down on that for the committee, please, and help us understand the different types of biases in machine learning. And I think I might
Well, bias is a huge... thanks for the question. Bias is a huge issue for machine learning. Let's make no mistake about it. Some people present bias as purely being a result of garbage in, garbage out. And of course, that is a factor. If you train a machine learning algorithm on a data set that is already biased, the machine will faithfully reproduce that bias. Famously, in 2018, Amazon was forced to admit publicly that an algorithm it was using for hiring was fundamentally sexist. That is, it was privileging applicants who identified as male over those that identified as female, even where the CVs were otherwise identical. But unfortunately, the problems of bias don't stop there. It's not that you can simply train up an AI on a perfectly unbiased algorithm and expect it to do the right thing, because fundamentally AI is not always meeting the right goals. It's meeting the goals that we say, not the goals that we want. So here, if I can give a non-AI example, back in 1908 in Paris, there was a dog that was lauded for a hero for rescuing children from the Seine. So a child had fallen in and the dog had rescued it from the river and had been rewarded with a piece of steak. And then it happened again and it got another piece of steak, but then it became a recurring pattern. This dog seemed to be rescuing children every other day. So when this case was investigated, it was discovered that the dog was actually patrolling the banks of the Seine and pushing kids in just so it could rescue them and get the steak. And this is a real problem with AI in general. We have to be very careful about the goals that we set it, because it's going to ruthlessly attack those goals, even if they're not actually the goals that we meant.
Absolutely, and I think I'm with Graham in terms of I'm very worried and nervous about AI for that particular reason. And how do we stop people believing that AI is the future and therefore putting all of their confidence in that, because then it becomes difficult to challenge the AI system? How do we stop that from happening?
Oh, again, a huge problem. Do you know the term bionic duckweed? If not, and for anyone else who doesn't, it's referring to a common pattern of thought, which says, well, we don't need to solve the challenge of electrifying our transportation now. We don't need to come up with new ways of getting renewable energy into transport, because somewhere down the line, someone's going to come up with a way of biologically engineering a form of weed which will be able to grow in enormous proportions, and then we'll be able to use that weed as a biofuel and all our problems will be solved. So no need to do anything now, because in a couple of decades, we'll have this magical technological solution which will address all our issues today. And it's actually a thought pattern that occurs very often in AI. People are looking to AI as a kind of magical solution, which somewhere along the line, which will solve various problems that we're currently facing. But I'm absolutely with you that that is not the way we should be thinking about AI. If we've got problems, we should find ways to solve them today and not look to AI as some kind of silver bullet solution that's coming down the line, particularly because AI today is so compromised by so many issues, and we have no idea at present how to address most of them.
Thank you, Professor. And I don't know if the other Michael, if you want to come in too, and just to throw in the police and the police use of AI, which is quite sort of prevalent in America at the moment. And there's lots of cases, but there's a recent case of a black man who was in jail for a week, accused of a robbery in a place he's never been to in his life. So how do we mitigate that, stop that from happening? How do we stop that situation?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Professor Osborne was starting to talk about where this behavior can arise from, and the first thing he mentioned was garbage in, garbage out data. If the data is biased, then the predictions will be too. And then I want to echo what he was saying is that's not necessarily the only problem. So one way to understand human racism or bias in general is using the quickest, roughest heuristic you can come up with that strikes you the first, and then run miles with it. And so if you see that there aren't many female CEOs in the world, the first thing you might conclude is that, well, that's not the sort of thing that women do. That would be that, and what we use our intelligence for. One of the things we use our intelligence for is to look closer and see how, that's not really what's going on at all. But if you have an AI that's looking for the simplest explanation, the quickest explanation it can find, maybe it doesn't have, maybe its model isn't rich enough to be even to be able to express what's really going on. You'll end up with something that can't even conceive of its own limitations and the necessity of relying on simplistic and ultimately incorrect explanations. I haven't looked at what exact algorithms police are using, but I suspect that's one issue involved. As for solutions, people can try conditioning predictions on certain things, and so there are various technical proposals for how you might enforce certain indifferences and make it kind of discount that. But typically, to the extent that the thing you're conditioning on is poorly measured, there will be some leakage there. And so that's difficult.
Actually, can I just ask one final question to you both? Are all data sets biased? Do all data sets have a bias in them? Sorry,
may
Professor.
I come in first?
Yeah.
So, firstly, if I may, I might briefly return to your question of policing in that actually the company I co-founded, Mindfoundry, has actually been working with the Scottish Police Force in bringing AI to work there. But I think the way that we've been doing that illustrates a general point that I wanted to make, which is that there are right and wrong ways to deploy AI. And I think the kind of use of AI for policing you were describing is one that I would describe as, just a no-go area. I wouldn't use AI for that at all. But instead, we recognise that there are many places to help police that involve just the automation of much lower level tasks. So, for instance, we're using AI to help process case reports, to do named entity recognition, to pick out the relevant pieces of text to help unify large databases. So I think we should always be keeping in mind that there are ways for AI to help that don't necessarily go anywhere near the things that we don't ever want AI to do. But to your question about is all data biased, I think that's absolutely right. So fundamentally, data is gathered by human beings for a particular purpose, and data always encodes some decisions, right? Data is a result of a decision-making process about what is worth measuring and what is not, and involves some sort of boundaries being drawn in the world, some sort of categorization. And none of those categorizations can be viewed as completely neutral. Of course, it's the result of some sort of assumptions on that human's part. So, it's an illusion to think that data is neutral, data is objective. It always encodes some sort of biases in the form of assumptions, and they always need to be questioned and examined before any AI is put to work upon that data.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.